Hello and welcome back to the In a Sense channel. There's been a long break since the last interview, and I'm really delighted today to be joined by two guests, Darius Parvizi-Wayne and Liberty Severs. Darius is based at the Department of Psychology, Royal Holloway, University of London, and Liberty is based at the Centre for Philosophy of Science. She's currently in Germany and also works from the University of Lisbon in Portugal. Today, we're going to talk about their intriguing preprint publication. The first half of the title is When the Interoceptive and Conceptual Clash. As you may be aware, this YouTube channel focuses on understanding the role of our felt internal bodily sensations, also known as interoceptive sensations. So that's why we're talking about this paper today. Please do subscribe to this channel to gain more news about inner body awareness and techniques to help improve your interoceptive sense and the way, hopefully, that you feel. So welcome, Darius and Liberty.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah,
thanks, Ian.
It's a pleasure.
Yeah, no, this is fun.
We've had a little chat offline, but please do start by giving us an overview of your backgrounds and what led you to explore self-modeling in Tourette syndrome and its relationship to interoception.
Libby, go ahead.
Okay, sure. So yes, thank you for having me, for having us both. Firstly, it's a good opportunity for us to have an open dialogue about some of the ideas from the paper, because it's all, I would say, the beginnings of a kind of something more substantial, hopefully, in the way of our research. So my background is in philosophy of mind and cognitive neuroscience. So I'm doing my PhD at the moment in philosophy at the University of Lisbon. And previously I'd worked in cognitive neuroscience on the topic of Tourette syndrome. And specifically, I was interested in inhibitory control and how exactly to understand this kind of perceived deficit of behavioral control in Tourette's, and trying to reach a more kind of nuanced understanding of inhibitory processes. And essentially, I felt that there was a lot of work to be still done in the field, specifically with Tourette syndrome, kind of overlooked condition, a lot of disparate, very interesting things going on. And I had a wonderful supervisor at Sussex, Charlotte Ray, who worked on Tourette syndrome at the time, along with Hugo Critchley and Anil Sath. So really, I was interested in carrying on some of these ideas and elaborating on a framework to understand Tourette syndrome. And this is how I got talking with Darius, who's, yes, also got a very interesting background and a lot of technical kind of proficiencies that were helpful for getting this paper done.
That's very kind. That's very generous. It's not true, but it's very generous. So I'm Darius. I'm less senior than Libby because I'm not even doing my PhD yet. So you got a pre-doc on your podcast. I finished my master's in psychology at UCL last year. I'm currently working in a cognitive neuroscience lab at Royal Holloway, looking at reward and motivation mechanisms underlying language learning. Oddly, I also kind of have a second job, which is as a researcher in a very exciting field called active inference. My orientation towards that, I guess, is philosophical at heart, but I've also, as Libby kind of alluded to, I've been working through the technical details of active inference because it is a rather technical framework. So I guess I'm interested in what's called computational phenomenology, which seems scary and big, but it's actually quite a simple idea. The idea is that phenomenology is the lived experience, which in principle is kind of all that we are intimately aware of, is our own lived experience. And the project of computational phenomenology is trying to ground lived experience in computational neurological mechanisms. So phenomenology itself is a field. People like Heidegger, Husserl, Sartre, Merleau-Ponty, philosophers, but it's about trying to take something that's fundamentally philosophical in first person and trying to ground that in third person structures. And so that's how I kind of came into this project, because as Libby, I'm sure, will say more about Tourette's, at least what we could find was, very solid technical third person accounts without really accounting too much, I would say, for the first person lived experience of those who have Tourette's, and especially what having a condition like Tourette's means for their conception of self. And I've been focusing a lot on so-called self-modeling, how underlying neurocognitive processes give rise to a sense of self and how that fluctuates. And so, it was a really interesting opportunity to get into a psychopathology or a pathophysiology. What would it be? A patho?
Psychopathology.
Thanks.
Oh,
too many. I'm sure lots of hyphens. And trying to also account for lived experience in that. And I think, as Libby said, the final thing I will say is I think it's a really good launch pad from which to understand other psychological and physical disorders. And I'm sure we'll be able to touch on that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you both. Yes, and in your paper, hopefully we'll come on to look at some of these definitions, but there's some fascinating ways of looking at the sense of self and how in Tourette syndrome that's related to the felt experience, but also, as you said, it could be a launchpad for understanding other diagnostic categories or for people who don't have any diagnostic categories. Just want to also plug, Darius, you said one of your other jobs or roles was involved in active inference, and you do have your own podcast series called Active Inference Insights, which is part of the Active Inference Institute's channel. And I see you have Mark Solms coming up on that.
Is he tomorrow? I think he's up tomorrow. I think for people interested in his channel as well, I would definitely point them in the direction of a podcast I did a couple of weeks ago with Ryan Smith. Ryan is a big figure in in interoception and modeling interoception for active inference. So people can check that out if they're interested in the stuff we're going to talk to today. But Mark, of course, is seminal in this, along with others. So thanks for the plug as well. Check out that.
I'll check out Ryan's interview with you as well. Back to the paper. So your paper describes a new way of understanding Tourette syndrome through these terms that are hierarchical generative modeling and active inference. So perhaps please can you, in layman's terms, explain what these two concepts are and why they're suited potentially for explaining Tourette syndrome?
Sure, I should probably do this. So active inference is a corollary of what's called the free energy principle, which is a principle of physics first espoused or formalized by Carl Friston, who is at UCL. The free energy principle is quite a deflationary, somewhat tautological statement that basically says that anything that persists through time can be described as if it is what we say finding model evidence for itself. What does that mean? In short, in layman's terms, it means that things can be always described as doing and perceiving in a way that confirms their own existence. So you're a human being. It's unlikely that we're going to find you underwater. What does that mean? It means that you're finding evidence by your own existence by breathing air, which allows you to persist. So active inference is what we would call a process theory of the free energy principle. The idea being that if you, Ian, are the same Ian tomorrow, then you must have abided by the free energy principle from today to tomorrow. And active inference tries to find a formal framework through which to understand that persistence. And we describe this more broadly in terms of Bayesian inference or variational Bayesian inference. I must say the free energy principle in its more fleshed out forms also is about variational Bayesian inference. But the technicalities don't really matter here. But the idea is that we embody or encode a model. So Bayesian statistics is a form of probabilistic reasoning. Basically, it's about how to update your beliefs given sensory evidence, given evidence from the world. And the idea that Carl and others have, and I'm using, and has become a very popular framework in cognitive science and psychology more broadly, is that all things, but let's say in this case human beings, encode or entail or embody, these are philosophical sort of second points, a so-called generative model, which means that we have, in layman's terms, a model of the world, and that's very much suited, or it defines the thing that we are. And you can redefine perception and action in terms of this model, in terms of doing what's called optimal Bayesian inference or optimal Bayesian design. And so, for example, if we take a really simple example, the idea would be that 37.8 degrees is a kind of optimal temperature for a human being to be at. And the free energy principle says that probabilistically, you're going to spend most of your time around 37.8 degrees centigrade. And what happens when you diverge from that is we get what's called a prediction error in some forms of active inference, which is the idea that you're always kind of basically predicting that you're going to be at 37.8 degrees. A prediction error signals that you're diverging from that, and then you take action, in a sense, to change the world, in this case, change your body, so as to return back to what we call an attractor set, or this kind of probability distribution that you want to return to. So active inference is a mathematical, technical grounding of basically of homeostasis in biology. And the idea is that we do that, we kind of do homeostasis up and down this, throughout all the levels that define us, by way of a so-called hierarchical generative model. And it's generative because we're not just passive receivers of the world. We also generate predictions about the world, and we generate action so to make the world more compatible or accord better with our predictions. So it's a massive research project. It's relatively difficult to talk about every single element unless you wanted me to go on for however long, and I'm very happy to. But yeah, it's basically the idea that humans are predictive, probabilistic machines who are always trying to optimize their lived world so to ensure their continued existence.
Thanks so much for that. Every time I kind of dwell on active inference and the free energy principle, it kind of sends me off on so many different directions, kind of down some fascinating rabbit holes, but also just some like sort of basic, quite affirming thoughts as well, and feelings like, oh yeah, this is how we work, this is how we operate day to day. Liberty, do you have anything to add to that?
So I not really, honestly, but I think it really, to me, seemed relevant as a framework because in Tourette's, the canonical symptom is tics, which are movements, and people have tried to understand for a long time, are they goal directed, are they habitual, what's the status of these kinds of movements, and how do we understand them? So by taking, a more general perspective, thinking about hierarchical generative models, you're also incorporating how action plays a role in regulating and anticipating how to regulate those kind of internal states. Yes, so I think it strikes me as a particularly useful framework to understand Tourette syndrome, but as you say, it also has this intuitive kind of, oh, of course, that makes a lot of sense. It's kind of tautological. As
You're the first person, Libby, who said that active inference is intuitive. That's good.
On a conceptual level, I think it's fair to say. Yeah. Explaining what it is, it does strike you as intuitive, but obviously the maths is another thing.
What I will say is, Ian, it's interesting that you sort of said, oh, okay, this is how we work. I guess it's inevitable that once one starts working within a framework, one recognizes the limitations of that framework. I'd say that I would just add to that. The free energy principle in many ways doesn't really tell you what anything does. It says that if there are things that persist over time, they can be described as if they are doing or conducting, in this case, variational Bayesian inference. In terms of actually whether things are doing variational Bayesian inference rather than being described as if they are doing that is an open question. There are people who will say that they actually are doing that, and there are people who will try and embed this in something like a feasible, biologically viable model. So this is where the idea of something like predictive processing happens, which is the idea that we are this hierarchical model where predictions shuttle down and prediction errors shuttle up, and that's one type of active inference where you're trying to find this kind of more, actually maybe neurobiologically feasible way of doing, in this case, prediction error minimization. But yeah, as Libby said, the actual free energy principle is relatively empty. Carl would say that as well. He's not going to be offended by me saying this. The point is that given that we can always be described as minimizing free energy, how do we go about doing that such that we can be described as doing that? So there are levels to the kind of analysis that are worth doing. No one, I would say, no one knows. Whether we're even in the right territory when we're talking about predictive processing or discrete state space active inference or variational message passing, whatever framework you want to use. But no one thinks that we have this kind of definitive one way that the brain works. But as Libby said, active inference is very much a framework, and I guess we were treating it as a framework in the same way something like reinforcement learning is a framework. Whether human beings actually have a kind of Q function or a reward value that they're keeping in their brain is a kind of secondary question.
No, that's a really good point, and that reminder that just because something appears, we can describe something in a way that matches what it appears to be doing doesn't mean that's what it's actually doing. And I think in Anil Seth's book, he quotes Wittgenstein when a conversation Wittgenstein had with someone about the way that the sun appears to move around the Earth, and they were talking about before the Copernican revolution, people thought it was different to how we view it now, but actually it still appears the same.
Yeah. What would it appear like if it was the other way? Yeah,
yes.
I think it's what Wittgenstein said.
That's it.
Yeah. I mean, that was why it was so difficult to prove that kind of Copernican revolution in thinking, because people are like, well, I don't see intuitively things are any different if I assume this framework. So what's the motivation for replacing this current paradigm? That's an interesting point, very interesting point. Yeah.
I think the idea, just to sort of wrap up this point, is that the power of active inference in many ways is that we can build models that are consonant with the free energy principle, which simultaneously might better explain empirical data, and also you can actually build things which implement those functions. So there's a whole push at the moment in active inference towards artificial intelligence. We don't need to go into it, but the point being that it's one thing. One of the powers of, really, some people say the fundamental power of science is to be able to make viable predictions. And if your model can make predictions that seemingly come true, then that's kind of sufficient. What's actually there in the universe is a kind of different question. And I would say active inference thus far, although it's a hot topic, has got some pretty good, there is some good work being done to validate the empirical findings that are consonant with active inference. And again, I would definitely point people in the direction of Ryan Smith's work. He's actually just released a paper, I think, last month called The Empirical Status of Active Inference and Predictive Coding or something like that. So that's a nice way to get into that topic.
Cool, thank you. So back to your paper and ticking in Tourette syndrome. So you describe the tics as both a form of sensory attenuation and epistemic foraging. So can we again maybe have a very layman's term definition of what these two different ideas are, and how do the concepts work together to explain the onset and persistence of tics in Tourette syndrome with the model you're putting together?
Sure. Libby, should I do? I feel like I should do the sensory. Should I do the sensory attenuation?
In my mind, I was thinking.
Nice. Yeah, see, we're in the synchronous manner. It's good. Okay, so sensory attenuation, at its very basic form, is like literally what the words mean. Is that when you when you receive a sensory input, you have synaptic firing, you know, all the way from the epithelium up to the brain. And this can be described in something like synaptic gain. And the idea of just attenuating it is that you're reducing the synaptic gain of that signal. Now, why is this interesting? Like, we know that obviously signals die and become you know, less intense and whatnot. Why that's interesting is because active inference, and this goes way, well, actually this doesn't, but it's integrated with a lot of work that was being done in the early 2000s by Chris Frith and Sarah Jane Blakemore and Carl as well. The idea being that active inference, the way that action happens in active inference is that you have a prediction that you are, let's say I have a prediction that for me to pick up my phone, for me to pick up my phone, I have a prediction that the phone is in my hand. And what I do is, therefore, I have this kind of prediction that I've got the sensation of my phone in my hand, and I act so as to fulfill that prediction. Right, so I've got this what we call prediction error, or there's some free energy there. I haven't picked up my phone, and by picking up the phone, I minimize free energy. I minimize that prediction error, and that's how you that's how action is explained. The underlying mechanism of action. It's slightly the wrong way around from intuition. The idea is that action is fundamentally causally preceded by a prediction that you are experiencing the very consequence of your action. Now, so a good critique of that would be, well, why doesn't the brain basically just say, well, I'm not holding my phone, and I'll update my model so that my model says that I'm not holding my phone, and therefore I'm not going to move, right? Like, why should I not just revise my model? Why should I act rather than revising my model? And because obviously, if you revise your model and say I'm not actually holding my phone, then you haven't got any free energy, because you've minimized that free energy, because now your model perfectly corresponds with the world where you're not actually holding your phone. The idea being is that you need to attenuate, weaken the sensory evidence that you're not holding your phone so that you can actually move to hold your phone, right? So, because if that sensory evidence that you're not holding your phone had a very strong signal, your brain would just update its model of the world, say, I'm not holding a phone, and you would never move.
And so sorry to interrupt. Assuming there that the reason why you want to hold your phone is because on some level that's a better state to be in. Like,
yes,
it's going to help you return to homeostasis or allostatic regulation or whatever. So, right. but in the interim, you need to bridge that gap. Is that
exactly? Exactly. Yeah. So yeah. So again, when I talk about all this stuff, it's very, in some ways, it's low resolution, because we're always talking about, as you say, something embedded within a hierarchical model. So your motivation in this case to pick up the phone will be embedded within a higher order preference that you call your mom. And why is that a preference? Because you want to have a good whatever, and so on. And that's an interesting topic, and I've actually just read. We can talk about that later if we want. But the idea is that you need to attenuate the evidence that you're not holding your phone, which means that, for example, the evidence might be the feeling of your hand, right? Not holding the phone. What the idea is that the entire sensory evidence along the proprioceptive arc of going to hold your phone is attenuated. So this whole movement of me going to pick up my phone, the sensations associated with that are attenuated to even allow me to pick up my phone in the first place. Okay, how does that feed into tics? Well, the idea is that, and Libby can, I think, talk about how, why that sensation appears in the first place, but there's this uncomfortable sensation, this so-called premonitory sensation, and just by moving the part of the body where that premonitory sensation has arisen, you are attenuating the sensory evidence from that part of the body, right? Because without attenuating that sensory evidence, you wouldn't be able to move that body, because that part of the body is part of the proprioceptive arc of that body's movement, right? So if, for example, I've got this sensation in my shoulder, by just moving my shoulder, I'm attenuating all the sensations in my shoulder. This is all happening rather quickly. I wouldn't recommend that people are going to derive any insight from doing it themselves. But this, for example, they can go back and see the early literature. This is arguably why you can't tickle yourself. You can't tickle yourself because in many ways you're attenuating the sensory evidence of that part of your body.
How does it differ from scratching an itch then?
Okay, so the difference with scratching an itch, the difference with scratching an itch is that you, in principle, when you scratch an itch, are actually changing the fundamental state of your skin receptors. So this was a conversation we actually had with Carl, back and forth with Carl, about whether doing a tic is enough to actually change the underlying state of the receptor, or whether you're getting it through this more indirect, you're getting the sensory attenuation through this more indirect route, where the evidence of the evidence of the sensations themselves are being attenuated to allow movement. Because if you think about an itch, the idea of an itch is that you've kind of got this interoceptive prediction error, and you scratch, and what you actually do is you mechanically change the world, you mechanically change the state of your body so that that interoceptive prediction error is no longer there. If we say that we can't actually do that with tics, and all we're doing is through this more indirect route of attenuating the sensations by moving, we're not actually really changing the state of the world. We're changing something called precision. But I won't go in. We can touch on precision if we want. Precision is a kind of second level dynamic to predictions. But anyway, I'm going to stop talking because I've rambled on for too long, and I'm going to let Libby talk about epistemic foraging.
No, that's really that was nice. I think it's interesting actually to I mean, thinking about why is it phrased like as if scratching an itch by people. I think it's because it's like it's kind of metaphorical, and it's a way to try and communicate to people who aren't experiencing that sensation what it feels like to have these urges, these kind of sensory compulsions. So this is very much, sensation driven behavior movements in sensory attenuation when we talk about the first level of our analysis. And then you get well, there's in many cases tics occur in the absence of these sensory compulsions. So the epistemic perspective on tics is essentially trying to understand what would be the explanation of tics if we didn't have this underlying sensory driver. And so epistemic meaning essentially sensation free. So in an idealized way of describing it, it's more exploratory. It's less driven by the kind of underlying sensory excitability of people with Tourette's, and more so like, okay, how can we leverage or use a tic-like behavior to selectively sample in ways that are informative to the organism. And this is actually really interesting, something that we spoke about briefly before starting. Again, some of the descriptions of why people tic, they describe it as a way of, as a form of investigation to understand the boundaries of social norms, for example, like having the urge to do some kind of movement versus, thinking, how can I disambiguate things that I'm uncertain about in my surroundings by taking certain actions. So this is, it was really interesting to try and like tease apart, okay, so what are the underlying processes that might be different from one person to the other when it comes to tics. Epistemic foraging, kind of what it sounds like in a sense, thinking about how we can make selective actions in the environment that are informative, that reduce uncertainty. And in the context of Tourette, we're interested in developing this idea that actually there's a really nice paper I should mention by Kelsey Pericad and a group in Melbourne who look at epistemic foraging in not in the context of Tourette's, but I think it's applicable here as a way of gaining evidence for oneself at the level of agency. So how can I make actions that make me feel like I'm more in control? So this is where we start to see something like agency in a, well, I don't know, there's possibly also a similar but slightly distinct agential process going on with the sensation-based ticking behavior. But yes, in this case, yeah, really thinking about the utility of movement to an individual who is experiencing some uncertainty about their environment, and in the absence of, say, I don't want to go into self-models yet, but in order to basically acquire evidence for one's own agency, taking actions like this is one way to basically to align one's beliefs about their own self-model. Darius, if you care to unpack what I just said in the technical.
No, I thought it was great. No, I think you're absolutely right. Yeah, I think the work of Kelsey Perricad and Jakob and those folks at Monash is really useful here. Yeah, I think I would just add, I mean, what they show there really nicely, and I think this has been shown in experimental work previously, is that we naturally seek out environments in which we can find evidence for an agency. There is something sort of inherently rewarding about discovering that you are a thing that can cause events in the world, whether that's an illusion or not. The beauty of active inference is that it couches all of this in beliefs. So there's no real illusion because the belief is there in some sense that you are a thing. There is something like you that can cause things in the world. And I think we can see this in, I'm drafting this paper on basically the self-other distinction and how that might come about. And I think you see a lot of this in developmental research. Children
Babbling and so on.
Yeah,
motor
babbling, them sort of ringing the bells in their pram. I mean, what is all of that? Well, it's basically the idea would be that you are finding evidence that if I do this, this happens in the world, and every time I do this, this happens in the world, and also that I can actually make this thing happen in the world, and this is directly downstream on what I expect to happen, or it's exactly linked to what I could happen. So there's something really nice about that connection between agency and predictability. The idea is that, like, I know what's going to happen as a consequence of my own actions. I'm not sure what's going to happen as a consequence of Libby's actions, but I know because of the type of predictive being that I am, that if I move my arm this way, it's going to feel that way. And that allows, or that entails a sense of control, a sense of agency, and perhaps a sense of ownership. So this is starting to feed into these ideas of self-modeling. But yeah, just sort of heads up, this is still pretty live questions, an ongoing project to try and understand, for example, how agency arises, how the sense of self arises. But actually, by studying psychopathologies, whether it's tics or something where a sense of self is more pronounced in its, in this case, in its dysfunction or in its alteration, like depersonalization or schizophrenia, you can kind of try and get to some underlying truths or underlying empirical facts by looking at psychopathologies and false, or dysfunction more broadly. So yeah, no, Libby, you smashed it. Don't worry, I'm ruining it.
No.
No, I can see how these the way that you both described that it fits in with sort of some of the going back to the interoceptive sensations, and a baby as it's developing, if it needs to learn how to return to homeostasis, how to feed itself and so on. So when it's figuring out, okay, there's this uncomfortable feeling inside of me, and if I do this thing, then I can get some food to settle that feeling. And then you can see how kind of this balance between trying to understand what an interoceptive prediction is, like the body will start to generate expectations that it's time to eat, even before maybe blood glucose or some other nutrient sensor has deviated below its sort of settling range. How that would be advantageous to develop an uncomfortable feeling in advance of that.
Yeah.
And then for the infant or even the adult to think, okay, if I do these things, if I make these actions, then I'm going to draw nutrients towards me in advance of when I actually truly need them. You can see sort of evolutionary how that's going to be use. Liberty, so what I liked about what you said is that you've used some self-reported accounts from people diagnosed with or who have been given the diagnostic category Tourette syndrome, and there seems to be quite a range of different descriptions. You said some of them don't feel these urges, some of them do. Is it that the sensory attenuation and the epistemic foraging would be more suited to different kind of, if you to group those people with based on their self-reported sort of descriptions of how tics appear to them, would sensory attenuation fit more with one group than the other? And the same for epistemic foraging? Or are they both operating for all people with Tourette's, would you say?
Well, I think this is why it's very much a work in progress, because we've identified these kind of 4 types, as it were, of or classes of ticking behavior. But it's I mean, it's a difficult thing to, I think it's possible empirically speaking to dissociate one level from the other in certain individuals, and maybe there's, you know, something to be said about the distinct kind of phenotypes that you might find in Tourette syndrome. So certain people, especially if they've got comorbidities or in the absence of comorbidities, will probably find, well, certain aspects of our model will lend themselves more. And even though it's not the case that everyone experiences these sensory compulsions and urges, it is still in the vast majority of cases. But there's I can't remember the name of the doctor, but there was a really interesting case of a surgeon actually who had tics. I think he was actually a neurosurgeon or something, but he didn't experience the sensory compulsion, so he didn't even realize that he was expressing, you know, he just say certain things out loud and not even really recognize that he just had experienced a tic. Yeah, I think it would be a really interesting thing to see how exactly different individuals, well, individual differences really in across these different levels, and their profile across also other conditions, comorbidities that might otherwise bring out or facilitate tic expression in certain contexts. The same with, I think epistemic foraging in particular is something that we can see quite clear analogies with, at least conceptually, with self-stimming behaviors in autism spectrum disorder. So I mean, there's even a difference here because tics are considered to be non-rhythmic. It's not like a consistent movement, rhythmically speaking. But in self-stimming behaviors where there is a very rhythmic action movement that's taken to similarly reduce kind of sensory discomfort, but it's more like that's driven by a distinctive kind of hypersensitivity in autism spectrum. So slightly different kind of behavioral characteristics, and also the background for what is really shaping ticking behavior might be slightly different, although there is something to be said about in general there seems to be like like a pressure almost to relieve one's sensory discomfort, whether it's driven by autism spectrum disorder or Tourette syndrome, through movements. Yeah.
I'm thinking here of a term I think Mark Miller's used, aerodynamics, sort of.
Yes.
And so you're talking about saying them self-stimming. How oh, it'll come to me, another category of diagnosis. But anyway, can we move on to these different models of self? So
Sure.
You've proposed a model for oppositional phenomenal self-modeling. And then also in the paper you mention the minimal phenomenal self and the narrative self, and how a conflict may arise between these two, and how that might fit in with a description or a sort of explanation of what's going on in Tourette syndrome.
You go ahead.
Yes, so we did. Great. Yeah, this is my lane. I will just add, I thought, yeah, Libby's explanation was very nice there, especially as it feeds into, or there's overlap here with other diagnostic categories. I would like to add that I think that actually in reality these diagnostic cutoff points are they're not arbitrary, they're useful, but we all engage in interoceptive prediction error minimization and epistemic foraging. I mean, like, it's happening all the time. And I was saying, before we went online, I'm always scratching and shaking my leg, and perhaps what distinguishes me from someone with Tourette's is, well, there might be plenty of things, something like the capacity for top-down volitional control, or the capacity, or the fact that perhaps I don't feel like my leg tapping intrudes on my life, or it's less socially unacceptable, or perceived to be less socially unacceptable. I think the point here is that active inference and reinforcement learning, and actually a lot of neuroscience frameworks, do a really good job at making things that can seem unique and like fundamentally odd and different and strange actually be grounded in universal characteristics of our cognitive systems. So just for clarity's sake, we all engage in interoception, interoceptive free energy minimization. We all engage in epistemic foraging. Not saying that having a diagnostic tool is useless, obviously not. It's very useful for certain people, and in your job you'll be aware, certain people come to you seeking certain things, and that's how therapy, whether manual or not, works. But just to also say that active inference, I think especially, does a very good job at humanizing some of these so-called psychopathologies. Anyway, to self-modeling.
No, I agree. Sorry, just to add to that, or to agree with what you're saying, and this the idea of, is something helpful or not, or is it adaptive or maladaptive, is really, I guess, what we're asking at the end of the day. And it's reminding me also of like some recent conversations around what classes as an addiction. Really, is it something that's going to interfere with your ability to function and or to cause harm to other people, and is it socially acceptable? And
I think just more broadly on that, what constitutes adaptive and maladaptive is fundamentally contingent on what we call the eco niche, or the environment that one finds oneself in. I think this comes out a lot when people talk about PTSD, for example. So PTSD in a war zone might actually be quite adaptive. You probably do want to have hypersensitivity to relevant sensory stimuli, right? So loud noises. Why? Because you're in a war zone. And so it's with respect to your generative model at that time, with respect to your need for self-preservation at that time, it's probably quite useful with respect to those goals. The problem is that you take a soldier and you put them back in suburbia. Well, the loud noises are less likely to be guns and more likely to be a car alarm. And that becomes maladaptive. But there's nothing different really about their neurocognitive system. It's about the eco niche in which they find themselves. And so a lot of this discussion that people are having, and you bring up Mark, and there are people like John Vervaeke who also talk about this, is we can't really think of psychopathologies decoupled from the agent arena environment. It's the dysfunction in that relationship that marks a psychopathology, but that's a two-way street. It's not, there's no really such thing as just like, I mean, maybe if one wants to be super abstract, there might be no eco niche, for example, where chronic depression is useful. I don't know. Or generalized anxiety disorder. Again, I don't know. It's an interesting question. But more generally speaking, we can't. I just think with tics as well and Tourette's, it's always worth thinking about, well, what environment are these people in? And that's going to come very nicely actually onto the oppositional phenomenal self-modeling and this narrative self thing. Okay, so self-modeling is a slightly, again, counterintuitive idea. It's basically, it stems from the claim. So for 500 or 400 years, really, of philosophy, people took the Cartesian René Descartes idea that we are a kind of substance. We are an ontologically separate thing from our body. We are a soul in many ways, and it's a Judeo-Christian vestige that we think that we're a soul and that we're floating somewhere behind our eyes. Something like self-modeling is in many ways a riposte to that. It says, well, there is no you, there is no soul. I mean, there is no you is a slightly more difficult thing, but there is no sort of substantial you, there is no soul. You are a experience that's generated by neurocognitive processes, and this is associated with people like Thomas Metzinger. Thomas, who Libby and I both know, actually says very explicitly, there's no such thing as you. There never has been a you. What you think you are is just this sort of bundle of neurocognitive processes. And the idea really here for us is that neurocognitive processes, such as those that underwrite active inference, give rise to the sense of self. So I'm going to talk about a sense of self. I'm not really going to talk about self. I might talk about selfhood, but I'm reticent to use the word self because people think about a soul or something that's substantially different from the body. So the minimal phenomenal self. So phenomenal here just means as it appears in experience. The minimal phenomenal self people have associated with the body and this idea of pre-reflexive bodily selfhood. And what that means is that at all times in conscious waking life, there is something that is like to be kind of living through your body. Not a kind of self that you need to reflect on and say, I am Darius, I am 25 years old, I am currently located here, but rather the fact that things feel, my body feels like it's mine. My body feels like it's present. My body feels like it's capable of doing things. And so this is the so-called minimal phenomenal self with those kind of fundamental characteristics. And interestingly, for our case, that's been tied to interoceptive inference and interoceptive free energy minimization. And this is the work of people like Matthew Apps and Manos Sakiris, who's just down the corridor from me, Carl, Lisa Feldman-Barrett, lots of people, Anil Seth, lots of people have basically said the same thing. And this work goes all the way back to Sartre and Merleau-Ponty in the 50s and 60s. So that's sort of the minimal phenomenal self. It's that kind of self that we're all very intimately aware of, but we don't reflect on it, right? We don't reflect on the fact that there's just a general sense of I-ness about the way that I live my life. Now, the narrative self is something more like what people are probably familiar with, is this kind of way that we conceptualize our own existence, our own way of being. And so part of my narrative self would be that my name is Darius, I'm 25, I'm from London, and so on. And obviously, in many ways, that narrative self is different from the kind of I-ness of the body because it's filled with propositional language and it's filled with the socio-cultural elements of my existence. So the very fact that I can say my name, right? My name is fundamentally a socio-cultural entity, where the city I've come from, and so on. So this is far more, one develops a narrative sense of self. It's a far more protracted diachronic process. Over time, you develop a narrative sense of self. It's kind of formed from your more, from the preferences that define the thing you are, the fact that, you're from a certain city, you speak a certain language, you have certain likes and dislikes and so on. And so this is not tied, I mean, it's obviously going to be underwritten by interoception, but it's more broadly about the way that you act in the world and the outcomes of your action. So what we're saying in the paper is that the minimal phenomenal self is putatively underwritten by the very type of interoceptive free energy minimization that ticking subserves. So although this is a very subpersonal, non-propositional belief, in many ways, the body is serving itself. Its natural way of serving itself is by minimizing interoceptive free energy. And you can think of that as you've used before, the example of glucose, viable bounds. If your body didn't restore back to a kind of viable bound of glucose, well, it would probably no longer be a body. It would disintegrate even more acutely. If your body wasn't going to be around 37.8 degrees, it wouldn't last very long. And so returning back to that peak of the probability distribution where you're most likely to be found is what we call the minimization of, in this case, interoceptive free energy. So the body in some ways wants to tick. right? Yeah, it has this prediction error, let's say, and it wants to tick so as to suppress that prediction error with this kind of subpersonal desire to retain bodily integrity. Now, why there's a clash is because it's well known that in psychopathophysiology, whatever the word was, like Tourette's and others things, and we can talk about the extension here, people don't want to tick, right? Like it's a taboo activity, it's viewed with a lot of stigma, and so their narrative self has got this preference that I am not a ticking thing. You know, I am, and this is a lot of this, of course, as we said, back to inference, it's all a belief, but I have a preference to not be a ticking thing. I have a preference to be in control of my body. I have a preference to be more socially acceptable. And so what happens when they tick is that they are providing evidence for their own bodily integrity, but not providing evidence, actually providing counter evidence against their higher order narrative preferences. So that is kind of the fundamental crux of this notion of oppositional phenomenal self-modeling. And something like a therapeutic process, although we were quite careful not to really say anything prescriptive here because it's all, you know, lots of individual differences, might be something like bolstering evidence for that narrative sense of self who doesn't want to be a ticking thing. And actually what you're doing like the fundamental thing is that if you don't tick, your body actually retains its integrity, right? Like there are obviously certain things we have to tend to in life. I may not want at this moment to eat, but if I'm starving, I'm going to go eat. And like, I have to do that for my bodily integrity. But in this case, tics, like you will be fine. It just feels obviously very urgent. And there's associations here with stuff like OCD, for example, where you have these really profoundly difficult urges and sensations. But yeah, something like a therapy would just be providing evidence for the fact that you aren't a ticking thing, that you don't need to tick. And that would look something like dehabitualization or decanalization through something like exposure and response therapy. But anyway, I'm going beyond the remit of the question. But that's the kind of basis of what we were calling oppositional phenomenal self-modeling.
Oh, thank you. I actually did want to ask about what type of strategies or interventions may support people. But Liberty, please.
Just like this is why I like to work with Darius. I would just say, I think I completely agree about the fact that you know, in many cases tics aren't desirable, but I think it's important also to bring back in the role of interoceptive processes. What's the sensory information that someone with Tourette's is receiving? And in this case, there's evidence for kind of like tic prone brain state of sensorimotor accessibility. So like it's called like a tic prone brain state. So there are these sensory feelings that people have which make them want to tick. But in the context of interoceptive inference, inferring the causes of that the interoceptive information, the prediction errors that you're receiving, is unknown to the agent, to the individual. So it regardless of whether or not in reality the behavior is something that is necessary, existentially speaking, it's kind of like there's a indifference towards what the actual cause of the sensory information is. In tics, it's all the person sees is like, I've got this excess excitability. What do I do with it? How do I reduce my interoceptive prediction error? So yeah, it's like it's probably got the same impetus, the same kind of impulse that any other homeostatically relevant behavior would have. So from the perspective of someone from Tourette's, it doesn't, there's no differentiation potentially between those like hunger satiation or tic satiation. But otherwise, I think that really nicely brings us to the dynamics, which I think are they are existential, or at least that's how we're characterizing it. It's really this conflict between something that has got that impetus, that homeostatic impetus, but also this abstract kind of conceptual level where you're reflecting on your own beliefs about who you are, and that's inconsistent with the evidence that you're receiving about how you feel right now. So yeah, that's all to say that just like I try to imagine what it's like. Obviously, I don't know because I don't have Tourette syndrome, but just try to imagine from the perspective of someone with Tourette's, what would the distinctions be that, or lack of distinctions be, that they make in terms of where the source of uncertainty or sensorimotor excitability.
So that's just to check I've understood what you said, and I think you've sort of helped unlock a different way of looking at it. Is within Tourette's, when there's this premonitory sensation,
Mm-hmm.
so they're unable to infer the cause of that.
Yeah.
But the tic happens anyway. So it's, whereas with something like OCD, or a type of OCD where there's ritualistic cleaning, for example, they might infer that the cause of the discomfort is the untidy house, or so that they've assigned a cause to the unpleasant feeling, and then the behavior is aiming to reduce the feeling. Whereas in Tourette's, you're saying the person with Tourette's hasn't been able to assign a sort of cause and effect way of reducing it.
Can I jump in?
Yeah, but just
no, go.
So I feel like it's obviously helpful to speak in this language of like assigning what's the cause and what's the effect. But in reality, I don't think we do that really much of the time, unless we're explicitly deliberating over, why did I do this? Why do I feel like this?
Mm-hmm.
So
we explain afterwards, after it's happened.
Yes, and exactly. And this is what you actually find in terms of certain key neuroimaging evidence basically points out that at least in the predictive coding message passing kind of explanation, certain regions like the pre-SMA explain away tics basically as involuntary, somewhere between like, okay, I've got this prediction error, I don't know where it's come from, but I'm just going to explain. The best explanation I have for it is that it was somewhat controlled. It was somewhat under my control. So yeah, it's I think this is where you also have a potentially informative perspective from neuroscience, so cognitive neuroscience. Yeah. Sorry, Darius, go ahead.
No, if I might add, I would say that under a kind of Bayesian brain hypothesis, regardless of what flavor of that you want, whether it's predictive coding or this kind of POMDP, this more computational way that we did it, there's always inference to a hidden cause. So it's never, at least in the kind of in the explanation that we as scientists give to the phenomenon, there's always an inference to the hidden cause. But Libby's absolutely right. This isn't an explanation or an inference in the sense of a propositional philosophical explanation. This is the brain trying to make sense of this kind of murky, blooming, buzzing confusion, as William James put it. This kind of sensory data that is just, zeros and ones or whatever you want to call it. And that's what we kind of mean by this lower level inference. Now, I think people might be confused, and again, this is why it's sometimes tricky to talk about active inference with a specific application, because you need to do all the legwork before you get into it. People might be confused because I said something like, if you just let tics be, you're not going to bodily disintegrate, whereas if you let hunger be, well, it's going to accumulate and you probably will disintegrate. So what's the difference there? Well, the difference comes down to something that is called precision weight. And I can very, very, very briefly touch upon that because I think it's important. So there's one level of active inference, which is the predictions. But then there's also the trust or the confidence that you have in those predictions. So anyone who's familiar with Bayesian filtering or Bayesian models will be familiar with this, because this is just like a fundamental fact of signals, right? Like a lot, there's a difference between signal and noise. All signals have a bit of noise. Some signals have more noise than others. So for example, if I'm in my bedroom and it's late at night and I look down at my garden and I see something that looks somewhat like a snake, could also be my garden hose, I'm probably not going to give too much credence to that sensory signal because it's dark, right? So I can't really put that much trust in that sensory signal. What happens is my general expectation that there aren't snakes in my garden in the UK overpowers any sensory evidence that there is, and I go on with my life thinking that it's the garden hose. Now, if I look at my garden in the day and I see something that really truly is a snake and looks a lot like a snake, and I'm actually now going to give a lot more credence to that signal because it's the day. And so my context is helping me say, okay, you should really trust that signal. And that signal is going to gain what we call, what in active inference one calls precision weight. I will flag people, and Libby knows is a bit of a bugbear of mine. People often, like, if people read these papers, I often hear people say that this signal is particularly precise. Precision here is just the inverse. Precision is the inverse entropy or the inverse dissipation of a probability distribution. So people are familiar with, like, basically, if you've got a mean, like, how dispersed are all of your data points from that mean, so standard deviation or standard error, for example. Now, that's like a very precise mathematical construct. Not everything that is precise gets strong precision weighting and affects higher level neuronal processing, and not everything that is imprecise gets low precision weighting. So just so people are aware, I'm talking about precision weight, not precision. I just written a paper if people want to read this about this distinction. But cut a long story short, basically the fundamental thing that we argue with these premonitory sensations is that they have hyper precision weighting. And this is really, really important, which means that there's no, like, maybe there is like a difference in the actual underlying physiology of these people. I mean, there will be, in the sense of the fact that there's an underlying physiological difference in the fact that their sensory data gets hyper precise weighting. But the point being is, and this is modulated by neurotransmitters. This is something like synaptic gain. But the point being that it's basically like that signal, that interoceptive prediction signal, is itself getting sort of inflated in importance. Right. So it's not actually the case that there's a sort of emergency at home, right? Like, it's not the case that your body is disintegrating, but the signal that is at least cueing the possibility of that is on steroids, right? It's got too much importance in many ways. And when we're doing Bayesian inference, we're always trying to find out the state of the world. We're always trying to derive what's called a posterior. And that's always a weighting between kind of the sensory data or the likelihood of the sensory data and my prior expectation. If this sensory datum has really high precision weighting, it's going to overpower my prior. And so even if I expect, like, no, I'm kind of fine and I expect my body to be in an integral state, if I have really high precision weighting over a sensory signal, which seems to be indicating otherwise, then I'm going to act so as to suppress that hyper precisely weighted interoceptive signal. And arguably this is at the heart. I mean, if you ask Carl, he would likely say it's actually the heart of basically all psychopathologies, perhaps, is a dysfunction in precision weighting of the sensory signal. So autism, for example, this what people call sort of hypersensitivity to I don't know, noise or light in certain cases, it would be hyper precise weighting over the sensory signal. And those dynamics are obviously going to be different for different psychopathologies or just pathologies more broadly. But anyway, that's just to clear up the confusion about what this signal is and how this all fits into this kind of Bayesian model. But I just thought that was important because I'm sure there was, well, if people aren't confused, then they'll probably be confused now. But
no, thank you. That's really one of the things I sort of want to do with this channel, is to bring people in with different sort of sets of vocabulary they're using and try to help translate between the two, and I'm learning as well. But what I'm hearing there then is it's kind of similar to I had Yoni Yashar on this channel, who deals his research is around persistent pain, and this is for people maybe who according to all sort of medical tests, they can't find any structural basis for the pain, but the pain persists, and it seems to be that the precision weighting given to some of these incoming information is so high that the person can't help but being conscious of pain at that time, even though it might not actually be posing any real threat to the integrity of their body.
Right. I mean, yeah. In this dynamic, there's always different things at play, and it's always worth trying to identify what part of the system is acting up, so to speak. Because, for example, chronic pain or something like a placebo effect might not be hyper precision over or precise weighting. See, I fall back into bad habits over sensory signals. It actually might just be really strong priors. So you might have a really strong prior that I'm going to be in chronic pain because you're used to being in chronic pain, and that is actually driving your posterior that you are in pain. These are complex things because they're embedded in hierarchical models. And I'm not sure a purely predictive coding account where you take one slice of that model and you say, okay, there's precision weighting here and we've got priors and the likelihood just at this level is going to be enough. Because as we know, the brain is extremely hierarchical. It's got lots of ridges and sulci and so on. But actually, just point people in the direction. I know Andy Clark in his new book, which is sort of actually a nice introduction to active inference. It's called The Experience Machine, I think. He talks a lot about chronic pain and placebo and nocebo. So if people are interested in just getting a kind of broad brush account of how that might be explained, then that's a good place for them to go to. Libby, you want to say something?
No, now you mentioned placebo, so now I'm just got interested in that, and I forgot what I was going to say. I mean, it was more. I think it was a point related to how we formulated tics as habitual behavior as well. But yeah, I think there's room in our framework to build expectations in, which we haven't really elaborated on yet, but it's a general concern about colleagues at Sussex do a lot of great work on demand characteristics and how expectations shape your experience of things, very much aligned with Andy Clark's kind of philosophy. So I think this is potentially a big confound when we're thinking about these. We're kind of drawn to thinking about parallels between active inference or the Bayesian brain hypothesis and these different conditions. But really, there's this is a conceptual toolkit that we're using. And there are probably a lot of other alternative explanations for certain aspects of at least experimental research. So I think that's the one thing I would say about maybe doing some more rigorous experiments which is something that we hopefully will get to do at some point after this paper. Sorry, tangent, but very interesting to think about in terms of these different conditions. Yeah.
And just on that, well, there's experiments. Would they be experiments to try and understand Tourette syndrome better, or would it be experiments to kind of look at ways to support people with Tourette syndrome, or a bit of both?
I think first we have to see if there's empirical
evidence for our model in the first place. I think.
Right. Okay.
But I mean, that's obviously the aspiration is to both of those feed into each other. I think we need a better understanding of tics, of Tourette syndrome, if we're going to provide any kind of improvement to therapeutic approaches. So hopefully there's something in our paper that might get us somewhere. But yes, testing first some of the at least kind of auxiliary hypotheses that we have would be excellent. And if that all works out, amazing. Another potential way of approaching this, there is some really nice work. Speaking of habits, one of the papers that we referenced by Stefano Palmenteri looks at trying to understand tics from a reinforcement learning perspective. And I think I really like the idea of encouraging, you know, let a thousand flowers bloom, just see how many research programs we could potentially implement and work together through collaboration, adversarial collaboration, to make distinct predictions, so that we at least know that maybe there's certain aspects of our model which are better or more satisfactory at understanding or explaining certain symptoms of Tourette's than the pre-existing paradigm. So that there's multiple ways that we could go about this that are exciting to think about. But yes, ultimately, this is grounded in lived experience of people who live with Tourette's. So we want to not make things worse, at least.
Just a question about around the different cultures and different geographical kind of distribution of Tourette's. Is it reported the same around the world, or is there kind of some variations in different ticking?
Structured variability, I'd say. So there's I mean, tics in general are incredibly, there's a huge variation in and it seems to be quite unique to each person in terms of, like, say, an elaborate sequence of movements which you'll only see in specific individuals. But there are also more frequently reported areas of the body where you'll find tics. So it's neck, you know, people often find they share in some excitement when they meet someone who has the same tic as them. But I think there's also an interesting point here about how societal norms and pressures also are different and may impact our understanding or prohibit our improved understanding of Tourette syndrome. So there's variability, but exactly how that arises or what the structure in that variability might be, I'm not sure yet. But it's worth saying there is cultural differences also in how in terms of how the environment shapes the expression of tics. So in this has been mentioned about some research in Japan. I have to admit I'm not up to date with how things might have changed or improved, but it seemed to be that tics, Tourette syndrome, was perceived to be more pathological. So yeah, in terms of Tourette's itself, ticking behavior is incredibly variable, but there's some structure within it, within that variability. But then you also have, you know, potentially other processes which are shaping whether or not people identify certain behaviors associated with Tourette's.
And has anyone looked at the times of day? Does the ticking happen more at certain times of day, or is there a kind of, or is it just sort of even throughout the day? Just wondering with fatigue, or, you know, is it more with fatigue or with sort of hormonal fluctuations throughout the day?
Interesting. I'm sure there is, but Darius, are you aware of anything on this?
No, there's a slight issue in psychology more generally, which is that we focus on what's called weird populations, weird being Western educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. And you'll find, I mean, I'm sure people have done this work. I was just having a little scroll and just seeing, I think there's been very little cross-cultural analysis. In part, I think because most of the work is assuming an underlying shared neurobiological dysfunction. And I think the other, because when you want to go into those individual differences, you're going to end up needing to do some qualitative or phenomenological analysis, which, clinicians definitely need, but maybe aren't doing it at mass scale. So like Libby said, there's going to be actually a great deal of fluctuation in the lived experience of people with Tourette's, because their narrative self, for just to take one part of this, is fundamentally a product of their enculturation in whatever society that they've grown up in and live in. However, it's a shame. Psychology, although it does look at these things in terms of pathologies, there just isn't enough work being done at the very granular level of what's called a micro-phenomenological analysis. So there are these things called micro-phenomenological interviews, where you get trained as an interviewer to really probe the very precise nature of a sort of instantaneous moment, but they're still very rarely employed. And when they are, unsurprisingly, it's with these weird populations. I will add that, one of the strengths, I would say, of something like what we've done is we provided a computational model which in principle is universal. And by universal, I mean, literally, you could implement it in a human, you could implement it in a machine. It's like, yeah, there's going to be probably variation within the parameters of our model, but it seems at least feasible to us that the structure of the model effectively or viably explains something like Tourette syndrome. And that's open for testing. And I think the exciting thing these days is there are ways of testing things beyond just psychophysical experimentation and experimental psychology. So just to give a couple, you can do computational modeling, right? So we could literally not test a human, and you could have multiple models, and you could have little in silico agents, and you could see whether they're acting in particularly Tourette-ish manner. Now, these are obviously somewhat limited because the human being is obviously more than the little part of their generative model. Like, a person who suffers with Tourette's is more than their Tourette's. They're more than the part of their generative model that yields that. So it's difficult to draw analogies between an in silico agent and an actual human being. Nonetheless, that sheds light. The other work, again, I mentioned Ryan Smith earlier. He's doing this really wonderful work called sort of empirical neuropsychiatry or empirical computational psychiatry, because what he does is he has this big sample, 500, 600 plus people at Tulsa, and he'll get them to do tasks. And the tasks probe different, let's just say parametric settings in our model. So, for example, the predictions that we make about hyper precision weight over one part of our model, we would expect empirical results leaning in this way. But he goes beyond just finding those results, and he then does model comparisons. So he'll take a reinforcement learning model, an active inference model, multiple of them, different parameters, and he'll see which one best fits the data. So he's not just applying them into an in silico agent. He's saying, okay, which model literally fits the best empirical data, the best empirical data we actually have from patients. And that, I think, is a really wonderful direction that more people should be looking at. Unfortunately, you need big sample sizes, right? So it's a struggle for people like Libby and I. Not that people should bestow sympathy on us, but it's a struggle. It's honestly it's a difficulty in science. Recruitment is always a massive problem. So these are the things that we're always kind of vying and contesting with. But as Libby said, I mean, the fundamental starting point is just to test the viability of our model just beyond a kind of intuitive, oh, that looks good and that fits with what, previous generative models. So, I guess the next step would be to try and implement that. And there's probably going to be a lot more logistical and pragmatic stuff that we have to tend to beyond, just the theory that we've done thus far.
Yeah. It's also something that's quite interesting. We've kind of done a version, but I think it needs some improvement, is like, how do we assess these experiences if we don't have, I mean, as Darius said, there's kind of micro-phenomenology that we could use as one method, but frequently the cheapest way to to acquire people's subjective reports is through questionnaires, and there's a real lack of like we've created a questionnaire that we can use to try and probe some of these dimensions of oppositional self-modeling, but there, you know, like it feels like we're building these things from scratch to a certain degree. So there's lots of things I think we need to get in place as well before we can do the experiments. But again, yeah, computational modeling, if we can simulate, say, a specific kind of like reflexive movement that's tic-like, and see whether the parameter variables that we've chosen can accurately account for what we observe in that behavior. When we say implement a task that's used to elicit that behavior, we can compare how well our account captures it in the absence, say, of you know, the person who would ordinarily be doing the experiment in front of a computer. But yeah, we actually just don't have big samples or accessible samples. Like I would love if someone has or knows of you know, a data set that looks at Tourette syndrome. That would be amazing, because then we could just like kind of see for ourselves, but it's just not, it doesn't seem to be there. Or at least, you know, we have to ask very nicely if people will share those data sets with us so that we can test some of our ideas. But yeah, it's like, it's amazing to think about where we could take the ideas of this project, but there's practical issues for sure that yeah, we need to overcome.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you both so much. Those last few comments have left me thinking about the simulations you might be able to do, and the potential there for. I'm just imagining now as someone maybe growing up or developing with the beginnings of the signs of something like Tourette's, and then sort of the niche they're in, or the culture they're in. Does it exacerbate it? You know, is it almost like it develops like a phobia?
Right.
And it becomes more intense because of the expectations, as you said, around the culture. So that would be, I don't know how you go about beginning to simulate more.
We need more longitudinal data. We need to see, to be able to assess how trajectories change over time or evolve over time. Yeah, that's a really nice idea, though. I
would say this is this paradigm, this movement, I would say, of so-called computational phenomenology is really just starting to take off. It was first introduced by Francisco Varela in 1997, which actually seems like quite a long time ago. But it's only really in the last 6-7 years have we started to build biologically, hopefully feasible, deep hierarchical models. And active inference, I would really say, is the kind of epicenter of that work. And so people should certainly check out a lot of that, whether that's our stuff or Lars Sandberg Smith or Ryan Smith or Casper Hesp. People are doing some really wonderful work here. And I'm optimistic, not only with respect to our own study. I think what's nice is that we're not abandoning experimental psychology, but with the development of new technologies and frameworks, we can start triangulating on constructs, psychological constructs like I don't know, anxiety, attention, memory, and so on, beyond just kind of indirectly and implicitly probing them experimentally. I guess my experience with psychology is when you do it, especially as experimental psychology, you never know if you're even getting close to the construct that you want to get close to. Always confounds. Always, I mean, in principle, many people don't, you know, people also talk past each other. You know, when we talk about agency and we're talking about the feelings of agency and epistemic foraging for agency, do you and I mean the same thing when we talk about agency? Probably not. I know some people who think it's a very high level metacognitive thing. Some people think it's a very embodied thing. So this is just a broader kind of meta thing on science, which is I think we probably need to make more of a concerted effort to ensure that we're speaking the same language. And I think a lot of that should be driven by clinical insights, right? When people with Tourette's, let's say, or schizophrenia or autism or whatever it is, say, I feel like I feel like I'm suffering in terms of my agency. Well, let's not just have that as a tick box exercise in the questionnaire. Yeah. Let's employ more sort of granular ways of probing exactly what they mean by that, because that will mean different things to different researchers.
Yeah.
Well, exciting times, I think, for the desire to get more clear on what we mean by all these words.
Yes.
Thank you both so much for your time. Any closing comments or any closing comments or anything else you want to add?
I think we even managed to get some of the meta science into the conversation, which is nice. So really, like, I would just say, well, thank you firstly for inviting us on, because we're early career researchers and we're trying some new ideas here. Would be very interested to know where we're wrong with our current thinking. So if anyone watching this feels like we could be corrected in certain areas or is interested in our research, then please do get in touch. I think it is exciting, and I think it is important to be focused on these kind of more overlooked conditions. So thank you for giving us the platform to talk about it. I'll my address, I think, will be up, and all of my details in case anyone wants to get in contact.
I will put those on the video description, but if you want to just sort of say where the best place to find you both online first as well.
Yeah, so I'm still using, for some reason, Twitter. So
X. X.
Yeah, no, X. I'm calling it X.
Okay.
At Liberty Severs on Twitter and Blue Sky, and email address libertysevers@gmail.com. You can find me there. I haven't got a website yet, so that's the next thing to do. But yeah, please do get in touch if you're interested.
You got to get a website, Libby.
I haven't got anything to put up there.
Very, very ethereal, I can imagine. Cool. Well, yeah, I echo exactly what Libby said. Thank you so much. Really fun. Normally I'm doing the kind of in your side of the podcast, so it's fun to be on the other side and also listen to both of you and have this conversation. So thanks again. I share also Libby's optimism. I think it is an exciting time, and I think hopefully, I hope I'm not going to regret this, we're going to get closer to actually finding out and discovering truths about overlooked pathologies, conditions, and just what it is to have a lived experience in the first place. And I think that's super exciting. I don't think these things are as beyond our grasp as they once were. So, and I think a lot of it comes from these kinds of dialogical exercises like we've done today. I think speaking about these things is really important. So, Ian, you're doing a great job. You're asking great questions, and we're hopefully getting somewhere approximating the truth. That said, as Libby said, as scientists, although I'm very flattered that she would call me an early career researcher, but I'm not. I'm trying to be. Nonetheless, as an aspiring scientist, and as Libby as a scientist, we want to be falsified. It's very important that we know where we're wrong and we can hopefully improve our models. And as we said, that's difficult without the robust empirical work that hopefully is coming up. But that said, there are falsifiable things in the paper. The paper is up on the preprint server, sci-archive, so maybe that could be in the video description. I'm not sure, but we're working through the review process. We've just actually given our first sort of response letter to our reviewers, so hopefully it's going to be out in press pretty soon. As for my own contact details, I'm on Twitter, I'm on X, D Parvizi-Wayne, I think. My name was too long. I'm not on Blue Sky because I have no idea what it is. My email's on the paper, I think. Darius.Parvizi-Wayne@rhul.ac.uk. I think my UCL email might be there as well. And people should check out the podcast. Active Inference Insights. It's every week. We have really great people, whether that's Carl or Mark Soames or John Pavecki and lots of other really fantastic people. So yeah, that would be great if people could check that out. But again, yeah, thanks, Ian. This was really, really cool, really fun.
Yes, do check out the Active Inference Insights podcast. Thank you both so much. We'll leave it there, and hope maybe we can speak next time you're publishing together.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much, Ian. Yeah, it was brilliant.